Hello and welcome to this talk about the Loftus family and fashion. My name is Breed and I am a guide at Rathfarnham Castle in Dublin. Rathfarnham Castle is the ancestral home of the Loftuses in Ireland, hence my interest. And overlooking a 40-year period, the Loftuses owned the castle from its construction in 1583 until the mid-19th century. However, this talk is going to focus on the century from the 1670s to the 1770s. And we're going to look at two branches of the family and hopefully we'll get a sense of what the Loftuses looked like when they were at home and also when they were at the royal court. So the two branches of the family, you can see them here. And it all starts off with Archbishop Adam Loftus at the top, the first Loftus in Ireland, originally from Yorkshire. He built the castle in the late 16th century, and his wife Jane had 20 children, but I've only included Sir Dudley because it's from him that we get the two most significant branches of the Loftus family. So you can see on the left-hand side, we have the Rathfarnham Castle, the ones that owned the castle. And then on the right-hand side are the branch of the family that lived in Wexford and eventually lived in Loftus Hall. And we're going to start with the Rathfarnham Castle branch. And we're going to go down to Lucy Bridges. She married into the Loftus family. She married another Adam, Adam Viscount Lisburn. And we're going to start with her because we actually have a portrait of her in the castle. So this portrait is of Lucy and it's in our ballroom. And you might think that she looks a little bit undressed, more than you would expect. She is wearing a white chemise there, and all ladies would have had that underneath their clothing, but it wasn't to be seen. And so instead of an elaborate gown over the chemise and a petticoat, she actually only has what's called a nightgown. And this was the loose covering that well-to-do men and women wore when they were at home and weren't having visitors. To be honest, it kind of reminds me of like dressing gowns today when you mightn't want to get dressed when you're at home and you're just comfortable enough going around in your dressing gown. And this may seem like an unusual choice of dress for a portrait. Not many people get their formal photographs taken today in their dressing gown. But it actually wasn't that unusual. The artist there, you can see it's by Peter Lely. Lely was following on from a tradition that was started by Anthony van Dyck. And he often depicted men and women in plainer clothing. So there's a couple of reasons for this. And one of them was that the clothing at the time was very elaborate and detailed. So to give you an example of one, you can see there's a lot of lace and embroidery going on there. Ruffles and also the curled frizzed hair that they have as well. And this was very expensive to portray in paintings, especially if you were having to using gold paint or anything like that. So plain silks and satins were much more profitable for artists to depict. Furthermore, Van Dyck and Lely were really in demand, and plain fabrics made it much easier for them to fulfill their commissions. And finally, by not following the fashions at the time, it allowed these portraits to become timeless and not to look dated in later years. Lely was a court painter in the royal court for Charles II, and Lucy and Adam would have been there at court. Lely's portraits of women are really well known, as they're all in a very similar style. Lucy's portrait became actually a really popular print. She was seen as a celebrated beauty of the day. And this is just another example of a Lely portrait in with a lady, and the Duchess of Portsmouth in a nightgown. She's actually a little bit more dressed, and you can see, like Lucy, she has the hair falling down and not in those frizzed curls. The Duchess here was actually a mistress of Charles II, so very closely associated with the royal court and Peter Lely. So Lucy was married to Adam Loftus, who became the Viscount Lisburn and also Baron of Rathfarnham. But we don't have a portrait of him. But we're actually able to gather information about his and Lucy's dress from excavations that took place at the castle. So there was a number of excavations that took place at the castle. The most recent ones and the most kind of profitable ones, artifact-wise, were in the 2014, and they revealed 70,500 different archaeological items, and some of those related to dress. And you can see it's wet there, so that meant that the artifacts like leather and wood were preserved. Most of the artifacts dated to the 17th and the early 18th centuries. So I've kind of highlighted there in red who would have owned the castle during those times. So we have Lucy and Adam, who we've already met, and then their daughter Lucia inherited from them. She married the Marquis of Wharton, you can see there, and then it passed on to their son Philip, who spent most of his time on the continent and didn't really live in the castle. So those are kind of who we mainly think would have possibly owned these items. And one of the most numerous finds that related to fashion were shoes, but parts of shoes mainly. There was only two kind of nearly complete shoes found, two man's suede shoes, and you can see one of them here. So you can see it's like upper part there, and then also the heel. And I've just zoomed in on the heel there because you can just see on the edge of the heel there that there's like a little bit of red colouring. And it's a bit harder to see, but on the bottom right hand corner of the surface of the heel, there's also a little bit more red there as well. And this is because it had red paint basically on it, and it's the style of the shoe and the red heel is nearly exactly the same as this shoe worn by King Louis XIV of France. So it wasn't Louis Vuitton who invented the idea of having the red soles on your shoes. And this shoe, you can see also is closed with a buckle. And there was a couple of shoes, or a couple of buckles found in the excavations, like this beautiful detailed one. Buckles became fashionable for shoes in the later 17th century. And prior to this, laces were the most common. And back then, laces literally meant pieces of lace. And to aid their, putting the laces through the eyelets of the shoe, they put little lace tags on the end, basically their version of the little bit of plastic we have on our laces today. So lace tags were metal foil, and the lace was placed on top of the foil, and then it was folded and pressed together. And that's what we see here on the left hand side. These are gold lace tags. That's very nice, but most of the ones that were found were copper alloy. We are getting a sense here, I hope, that these were very elaborate, excuse me, shoes that would have been worn by people like Adam. This shows you some of the kind of earlier shoes that from the kind of earlier part of the 17th century. This is Charles I, and it's a little bit hard to see because he's wearing white stockings and white shoes, but his on the kind of far right there, that shoe, the sides of it are actually really, really low, and you can see his stocking through the shoe. And also you can see that there was a fashion for white shoes, and this was common up onto, for both men and women, up onto the kind of Civil War in the 1640s. And different materials were used for indoor and outdoor shoes. Outdoor ones were kind of heavier leathers, and then indoor ones used fabric and softer leathers for the upper parts of the shoes. And also soft leathers and fabric were used for ladies' shoes. And this is an example of a lady's shoe. Most of the shoe parts that were found were actually for shoes for women. And it's an interesting thing that the shoes at the time, they didn't have left and rights, they were all made straight. Unfortunately, as you can see, there is no upper part to this shoe, and there was no fabric other than the two suede shoes there. No fabrics have actually survived. This style is actually very similar to one in this portrait. So it gives you a better idea of what the upper part of the shoe looked like. And again, it's a bit easier in this one to see the low sides on the shoe. You can see her black stockings through it, and also the very similar wedge heel as well. And you can see that the heel is covered with the same material as the shoe. So that was common as well. And this is kind of shows you the range of different shapes to the heels. So they became a bit blockier over the years, and also a little bit shorter. One of the reasons that there was only 2 complete shoes found is that the shoes appear to have been taken apart by a translator. A translator was a tradesperson who salvaged parts from worn shoes. And there's also evidence of attempts to repair some of the shoes that were found. So that's our shoes. More other evidence about their clothing, seeing as no clothes were found, is all the bits that were used to close the clothes and put them together. So for Adam, he would have used a lot of buttons, and these are some wooden buttons that were found, and they would have been wrapped with thread, thread of linen, silk, or even gold thread. And copper alloy buttons were found as well. And a lot of the buttons at the time weren't actually functional, they were more ornamentation. And there was a new fashion that led to the need for more and more buttons. So on the left hand side there you have Charles I. So the earlier part of the 17th century, the fashion was for breeches that he's wearing, the kind of trouser part, and then on his top what was called a doublet, which had been fashionable since the Tudor period. I'm just going to point out, just as an aside, you might notice the kind of slash sleeves he has on his doublet, and that will come up a little later. Charles II then on the right hand side also has breeches. His breeches are a lot fuller, and they're actually called petticoat breeches because they kind of look like a skirt. But on his top though, he's not wearing a doublet, he's actually wearing a coat. And this, the coat and a vest underneath, was something that he had adopted in the later 17th century. And even though they might have been used in the style, buttons were placed all along the edge of the coat and the vest. So you can see his coat is only closed at the top, but there's buttons running around the whole side and very close together as well. Adam Loftus would have definitely followed this fashion as he was at the royal court. And despite his many misdeeds, Charles II actually seems to have been a fan of him. And the vest was really, really popular. The diarist Samuel Pepys noted in 1666 that the court is full of vests. And this portrait gives you a better idea of what I'm talking about. So this gentleman is wearing a black coat, and underneath, which is unbuttoned, and underneath he's wearing a gold coloured vest. So the coat goes to just above the knee, and the vest is also quite long. And this was viewed as a more informal outfit, and this suited Charles II as he enjoyed outdoor activities such as tennis and deer hunting. And the latter was something that Adam Loftus was also enjoyed. He had a couple of positions. He was the ranger of the Phoenix Park when it was a deer park, and he later became the ranger of all of the King's Parks in Ireland. And there was also a deer park around Rathfarnham Castle during Adam's time. This adoption of the vest and coat is seen as basically the precursor to the adoption of the three-piece suit of waistcoat, jacket and trousers. Along with buttons, there was also a couple of sleeve links found. And these were used in closing lace cuffs that men had at their wrists. So they're kind of like a cuff link and a button, and it's only when the cuffs become stiff in the 1800s that cufflinks are used. So the sleeve link these ones are like particularly nice. There was a couple of found, but this one is made of silver, and then on the top of it there is glass paste, and the glint of gold underneath is gold foil that has been shaped into flowers. And then underneath it, the kind of bottom part, you can just see there's four shells pointing into the center of the sleeve link. And this is certainly something that the Loftuses would have worn. This is high-end stuff. So the lace cuffs and collars that we see on the wedding suit on the left-hand side were detachable. This made them easier to clean and to change them when you wanted a different style. And they were attached to the clothing with pins, and a lot of pins were found by the archaeologists. So this photograph shows you a selection of them. There was actually over 9,000 of them in total, and many of the pins would have been used for women's clothing. Seems a bit strange, but buttons weren't used in women's clothing at all. They were just for men's clothing. And along with pins to fix their dresses, they would have also had hook and eyes. There were a couple of them found, and you can see one of the hooks there. I will talk a little bit later about how pins were used in women's clothing, but the amount of pins that were found has led archaeologists to believe that the lace making took place at the castle. So that's where we're going to talk about next, lace. This picture by Vermeer shows a lady with actually a lace collar herself, and she is making bobbin lace. So you can see she has a blue cushion there that she's working the lace on, and to the left there you can see white thread wrapped around wooden sticks that are called bobbins. And she would have used the bobbins to twist and braid the thread. And then we can see the pins on the cushion. You can just see the glint of the pins that she's using to fix, to secure the lace on the cushion while she's working on it. And a lot of pins, as you can imagine, were required to make a piece of lace. So that's why they think lace, because of all the pins that were found at the castle, that surely some of them were used in lace making. And to support that, the fact that bobbins were actually found in the excavations as well. You can see them there on the left. And they're very, very similar to the ones that are used today. You can see there in the photograph on the right hand side what they look like, and also you get a bit of an idea of how bobbin lace works. Look for a video online. It's kind of mesmerizing how they did it. And there was also other accoutrements that were found associated with bobbin lace making. So that has led them to think that it was made at the castle. Whether it was done by the ladies of the house or by servants, we don't know, because there's little other evidence of lace making taking place in Ireland at that time. And I'll just show you a piece of, this is a bobbin or a lace cuff that would have been worn. Other kinds of embellishments that were made to their dress would have included jewellery and accessories. So there was a couple of metal rings that were found, but what we have here on the left is a carnelian ring. It's half of a carnelian ring. It is a semi-precious gemstone, which is probably mined in Germany. And I really like it because it has this like lovely faceted sides on it. And beside it is a gilded brooch. So the gilded metal has been twisted into kind of a flower shape, and there is a piece of quartz in the center. There's also, they found 2 rock crystal gemstones, but on the left, very fancy, is this emerald. And it actually is, the cut it has is called an emerald cut. And going from its size and its shape, it is thought that it would have been part of a ring. And this emerald was mined in Colombia, apparently where the best emeralds come from. And emerald mining started when the Spanish colonized that region of South America. You would imagine a ring like that would have been worn by someone like Lucy, and that it fell out at some time. But it really gives you an indication that at this time in the 17th century, that the age of exploration was having an impact on the amount of trade that was being done and the contacts that people had for such exotic items. And finally, this thing initially perplexed the archaeologists on what it may have been, but it's actually the remnants of a folding fan. The first fans produced in Europe were made in the 17th century, and they were inspired again by their contacts across the world, but this time in the East. So they're kind of Oriental inspired. Early ones were fixed, but later folding fans developed in the later 17th century. And what we have here is the montures, or the sticks, of the fan. Ours is made out of tortoise shell, but other exotic materials such as ivory or mother of pearl were also used. And the leaves of the fan, or the kind of the fabric part, would have consisted of like lace, linen, vellum, or kid skin. And they were really, really, really expensive. A fan could cost as much as a third of a man's suit. So we know that the Loftus had connections and the wealth to keep up with the fashions of the day. So that sums up what the excavations tell us about how the Loftuses dressed. But we're now going to move on from the 17th century and into the 18th century. Now, you might remember that I said that Philip, right down at the end of the family tree there, didn't live at the castle. And after he had some major financial difficulties, he decided to sell the castle. And he sold it to a man, to William Connolly of Castletown House. And Connolly rented out the castle to various people, and including a man called Bellingham Boyle. So this is Bellingham Boyle. And as you can see, he liked very fine clothes. So he's wearing a lovely green coat with its fur-lined, possibly ermine lining. And underneath, he has this gorgeous waistcoat or vest. A lot of gold thread and beautifully embroidered flowers on it as well. And he's left it unbuttoned mostly so that you can see his lovely shirt underneath. His clothes were obviously very nice because the castle was actually robbed when he lived there, and included in the items that were stolen were some of his clothes. Clothes were very, very expensive, anyone's clothes, but obviously his were particularly nice. Some of the changes that were made to the castle in the 18th century we credit to Bellingham Boyle and his wife Sarah. So possibly the Rococo ceilings in the castle and also the larger Georgian style windows. And he obviously liked to show that off. He entertained in the castle 2 different Lord Lieutenants during his time. But all of this spending led to some pretty serious financial problems, and he had to sell his lease to the castle. And that's when the Loftuses get back into Rathfarnham Castle. Just to point out, you can now see a gorgeous copy of this painting in the castle, and it has a lovely frame on it, and it's the newest edition, only there a couple of weeks ago. So you must have a look at him back in Rathfarnham Castle. So we get back to the Loftuses now, and I'm showing you the other side of the Loftus family tree. This is the Wexford branch, and we're going to talk about the 18th century. So we're going right down to the end there, and Henry, Earl of Ely. He's the man that we credit with much of the renovations that took place in the castle in the 1770s, and basically turned the castle into how it looks today, kind of Georgian style country villa. You can see there Henry had 2 wives. So we have Frances Monroe and his first wife, and then his second wife, Anne Bonfoy. I'm going to talk about Frances first. And I've included some of her side of the family because her 2 nieces, Dolly and another Frances, are part of the Ely family portrait. So this portrait gives a good idea of the various clothing styles of the later 18th century. So let's go through our cast of characters. We have Henry there in the centre with his wife Frances, and her niece Dolly is standing on the left, and then the other niece, Française, is sitting at the harpsichord. And also on the right, we have an enslaved Indian boy. We're not really too sure if he existed, but he may have, or he could be artistic license. We're not really too sure. But he's depicted in a kind of exotic style dress, wearing a turban. And he's holding a cushion which holds two coronets. And this is to indicate that Henry has become the Earl of Ely. And this is the reason that the painting was commissioned. He became the Earl in 1771. And Française, consequently, is now a Countess. And both Henry and Française are wearing the robes of their new rank. And this type of dress would have been worn at the royal court, or in Dublin when they went to Dublin Castle and the Lord Lieutenant was there. I'm going to focus on the women first, starting with the Countess. And you might notice that the Countess and Dolly have these kind of raised hairstyles that were, you probably know, were quite popular in the 18th century. This kind of egg-shaped hairstyle was popularized by Madame de Barry. She was the last official mistress of Louis XV of France. And you'll notice that I will refer to France or use French terms a good bit. That's basically because France set the trend for fashion. So we're now going to talk about the Countess's dress and with what we can't see. So underneath all of her clothing, she is wearing a chemise. And this was what would have been washed actually quite regularly because it was next to the skin. And this helped to protect the rest of the clothes from getting really dirty. On top of her chemise, she would have had what were called stays. So this is what stays look like. To our eyes, they look like a corset, but they weren't as restrictive as what we think corsets are. Stays were a layer of linen and silk, and then there was boning in between. And their function was to kind of smooth out the silhouette rather than to shape the body. And most of the ones that I've seen were laced in the front, so you could actually do it yourself. On top, then the next layer would have been a petticoat, which you worn on the bottom half. And perhaps she had more than one petticoat as well. And we can see the outer one here, which is white with gold detailing. White petticoats were worn at royal courts. And then on top of that, we have the gown itself. And it's in the traditional colours of vermilion and white. So red and white. And this was put on like a jacket from the kind of the back and then fixed in the front. But something that I always kind of find hard to grasp, but the dress didn't actually meet in the front. The two sides didn't meet. There was a gap across the chest, and this was bridged by a stomacher. And this is what a stomacher looked like. It was a V-shaped piece of material, and the edges of the stomacher would have been pinned into the stays and also into the two sides of the gown. On the right hand side there, along the edge of the stomacher, you can just about see the pinholes where it was where the pins went in to the stomacher. This portrait here of a different countess gives you a better idea of kind of all the different parts of the dress. She's wearing the white petticoat, the red and white gown, and the bejewelled stomacher, the white V-shaped material across her chest. She also has quite similar jewellery to our Française, with a high-necked necklaces, and then a longer necklace, a lower necklace as well. So you can see that there, but Française is doing a little bit better. She also has a bracelet as well and a fan in her hand. The name that's given to the dress that the Countess is wearing, and also her young niece Française is wearing, is called a robe à la Française. And the young Française, her one is in a blue silk, and she also has a white stomacher. But hers is a little bit more informal than the Countess's, and she's wearing an apron over the petticoat. So this portrait here of the Countess Ho is very, very similar, but in pink. And what distinguished a robe à la Française from other dresses is the back of the dress. So you can see on the right hand side there, the robe à la Française had these two large pleats that went from the shoulders hanging down to often a large train. In this example, the pleats are quite narrow, but they could be very, very wide, and this added a lot of material to the dress. You might notice also that the hips are quite wide on this gown, and this was achieved by the use of a pannier. So a pannier looked like this. So it was basically similar to hoops that came later, but a pannier was made of linen and canes, and it was used to make the woman's hips look wider at the sides, but it didn't add any extra kind of volume to the front or to the back. You can see they're actually quite flat in the front. And even when the pannier became less fashionable in everyday dress, it continued to be necessary at court. And the sizes that these could get to were absolutely ridiculous. You can see quite an extreme example here. You could nearly have like a side table on either side of your hips there. So the Countess would have worn not an extreme size one, but she probably is wearing a pannier as well. Dolly then is wearing, who's standing up there on the left, she's wearing a different style of dress. It's called the Robe à l'Anglaise, and this was a much more informal style to the Robe à la Française. It didn't require a stomacher, as the dress met across the chest, and her dress doesn't show the petticoat underneath, but she's lifting it up in the portrait in order to show it off. The main difference between the two dresses is the Robe à l'Anglaise had a fitted back. So this example here gives you an idea. It doesn't have those big pleats. And also there's no pannier. The gown does go out at the back, and this was achieved by using a bum roll, which was basically a sausage-shaped cushion that you tied around the back of your hips, or a bum pad, which is the same idea, but it was basically like two square cushions that you tied around your back. So that's all of the women. We'll go back to Henry then. So Henry, starting off with his hair is covered with a wig, and if you look at the back of his neck there, you can see some black material. So this suggests that he's wearing a sack wig. And this type of wig is where the back of the wig, the ends of it, were placed into a black material bag, and that was tied then with a bow. On top of all of his clothes here, he has an ermine trimmed ceremonial robes, and it's tied with ribbon. And these would have probably been satin lined, and so really richly rich materials and fine detailing in these. I don't know what material his coat and his breeches are made of, but they're this beautiful gold glistening material, and that also picks up the gold in Française's petticoat. And this time the breeches are starting to get more and more fitted, and he's obviously wearing them with white stockings, and you can see that the fashion for buckled shoes continues. If you're anyway interested in having a look at this dress, it's in the National Gallery and is really nice and big, so you can see all of the details really, really clearly. We do have other portraits of Henry, and this one shows him with his second wife Anne, and he's wearing something much more typical of what was worn kind of more day to day. But he's really still Henry. He's shown himself at his best. There is elaborate detailing on the edges of his coat, waistcoat and cuffs, and possibly using some silver thread in that embroidery. His second wife Anne has adopted the fashion of feathers in her hair that was popular in the 1770s, and her hair is a little bit higher to what we saw with Française. The really, really high hair was popular in the 1770s. The larger styles were popularized by Marie Antoinette. I suppose her most famous one is the one where she had a ship in her hair. Anne is also wearing a shawl or a fichu around her shoulders, also popular in the 1770s. This painting is not at the castle, but we do have a portrait of Henry at Rathfarnham, and it looks very different to the other paintings we've seen of him. So this portrait is in the ballroom of the castle, and as it happens, it's actually right beside our portrait of Lucy. And Henry is in a much more informal style in this painting. He's not wearing a wig at all, and he's also not wearing 18th century clothing. He's wearing the plain black breeches and a doublet with a lace collar. And you might also notice that his sleeve there is ripped, like we saw, or slashed, so we can see the white shirt underneath that we saw Charles I have way back in the early 17th century. And this dress, I suppose, became known as the Van Dyck style dress. And it was named after Van Dyck's portraits of men in the 17th century. And in the 18th century, it became a trend for men to depict themselves in this way. And it was possibly a way of making their portraits seem like timeless, or that they were knowledgeable about kind of the old masters of the arts. So although we've moved through a whole century of fashion there, Henry showed us that people continue to be inspired by fashions that became before them. So we've kind of gone full circle there. And this is where I'm going to finish off with Henry. So I'd just like to thank you very much for listening to this talk. I hope you enjoyed it, and that you will get a chance to visit the castle at some time and see the rooms where the Loftuses lived. As you can see, all of our contact information is there. And at the moment, we're open 7 days a week. And until the end of the year, we are free of charge. So I'd just like to say thank you, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Goodbye.